The July sun bore down on the small town of Willow Creek, its heat a palpable force that shimmered over the weathered pavement of the old Route 17 gas station, where Elias Thornton's 1968 Chevy C10 pickup sat like a relic of a bygone era, its once vibrant red now a patchwork of rust and faded glory. Elias, at 82, adjusted his worn veteran's cap, the embroidered insignia of his Vietnam service barely legible after decades of wear. His hands, once steady enough to guide a sniper rifle through the dense jungles of Khe Sanh, now quivered with the weight of time, not fear, as he eased himself out of the driver's seat, his right hip, scarred by a grenade blast in '68, groaning with each careful step. A reminder of battles fought in places most in this town couldn't find on a map. The gas station, with its peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered intermittently, was a microcosm of Willow Creek itself, tired, overlooked, yet stubbornly enduring, much like Elias, who moved with a quiet resolve, not arrogance, toward the pump, his faded flannel shirt clinging to his frame in the oppressive heat. Near the edge of the lot, a group of young men in leather jackets lounged against their sleek motorcycles, their laughter cutting through the stillness like a blade, their tattoos a bold declaration of a rebellion they never truly earned, and as Elias approached the pump, their eyes locked onto him, seeing not a man but a target, an easy mark in a world that had moved on without him. "Look at that junk heap!" One of them, a lanky man with a shaved head and a skull tattoo on his neck, called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet it hasn't moved since the dinosaurs." Elias didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the pump as he inserted the nozzle with a precision born of habit, but the words stung, not because they were true, but because they echoed a deeper truth. He was invisible to these men, a relic in their eyes, just as he was to most of Willow Creek, where the sacrifices of men like him were footnotes in a history book no one bothered to read. Inside the station, a teenage clerk with earbuds and barely acknowledged him as he paid for his gas and a pack of gum, her disinterest a silent confirmation of his fading presence, and as he returned to the pump, the scent of gasoline mingling with the summer air, he noticed the lanky biker approaching, his boots scuffing the pavement with deliberate intent, the stench of stale beer and motor oil trailing behind him like a shadow. "Bet this truck doesn't even start half the time." The biker sneered, running a finger along the Chevy's dented hood, leaving a smudge in the dust, and Elias looked up, his gray eyes meeting the younger man's with a clarity that had once spotted enemies through monsoon rains. "It gets me where I need to go," he said simply, his voice steady, unprovoked, but the biker, craving a reaction, stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "This ain't a museum, Grandpa. Move your scrap heap before I do it for you." The others joined in, forming a loose ring around Elias, their laughter a weapon, and as Elias turned to replace the nozzle, one of them, a stocky man with a buzz cut, kicked the gas can from his hand, sending it skidding across the pavement, fuel pooling in the cracks, and before Elias could react, the lanky biker shoved him, a cruel, careless push that sent him crashing to the ground, his palms scraping against the rough surface, his hips screaming in protest as pain lanced through his body. Stars flashing in his vision, the laughter of the bikers rising like a storm, a sound so foreign to the camaraderie he'd known in the jungles, where men fought and died for each other without a second thought. Lying there, Elias felt not defeat, but a profound sorrow, not for himself, but for the world he fought for, a world where indifference was the norm, where a woman pumping gas nearby glanced over and then turned away, where a delivery driver pretended not to see, where the clerk inside the station scrolled through her phone as if nothing had happened, and in that moment, Elias understood the true cost of his service, not the wounds, not the nightmares, but the realization that the freedoms he'd bled for allowed people to walk past a fallen man without a second glance. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his movements deliberate, a thin line of blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, staining the pavement like a quiet accusation, and as he stood, the bikers stepped back, their laughter fading, disappointed by his refusal to brake, and Elias climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life with a stubborn growl, and drove away, the echo of their taunts lingering like a bitter aftertaste. He headed toward the outskirts of town, where a small mechanic's shop run by a man named Carl had once fixed his truck without judgment, but Carl had retired, and his nephew, a wiry young man named Jesse, met Elias with a dismissive shake of his head. "We don't work on relics like that anymore, too hard to find parts," he said, his tone clipped, and Elias nodded, accepting the rejection with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through countless refusals over the years, and as he drove on, the pain in his hips settled into a dull ache, memories flooding back like a tide, memories of the jungles where he'd carried a wounded comrade 5 miles through enemy territory, of the nights spent in foxholes with rain soaking through his boots, of the letters he'd written to his wife, promising to come home, a promise he'd kept, though the man who returned was not the same one who'd left. He pulled into Willow Creek's Central Park, a modest square with a fountain that hadn't worked in years, and found a bench beneath a sprawling maple tree, its leaves whispering in the faint breeze, and from his wallet he withdrew a photograph, its edges worn from years of handling, 8 men in fatigue standing before a helicopter, their smiles a testament to survival, and on the back, in faded ink, the words, "Echo Team, 1968, Survivors of Kisan." A memento of a time when loyalty meant everything, when no one was left behind, and tucked behind the photo was a card he hadn't touched in over 50 years, a number scrawled in precise handwriting. "Emergency contact, Echo Team, 72nd Division." A lifeline he'd never used, not through the death of his wife, not through the loss of his son to addiction, not through the decades of solitude that followed, because pride, or perhaps stubbornness, had kept him silent, but today, something had shifted, a crack in the foundation of his belief that he could carry this alone, and with trembling fingers, he dialed the number on his ancient flip phone, expecting nothing, expecting the line to be dead, but it rang, once, twice, and then a voice answered, sharp and professional. "Verification code." And Elias, his voice steady despite the years, replied, "Echo 72 Bravo, Elias Thornton." And after a brief pause, the voice returned, "Stand by for confirmation, Sergeant Thornton." And moments later, another voice, older, gruff with the weight of command, came on the line. "Elias Thornton, it's been too damn long." And Elias, hearing the voice of Colonel Marcus Everett, a man he hadn't spoken to since the war, felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. "I need the team, Colonel," he said, and without hesitation, the reply came, "Help is coming." Across 4 states, the call rippled outward, reaching men who had long since traded their uniforms for civilian lives, men in their late 70s and early 80s, men who had built families, fought new battles, but never forgotten the bond forged in the crucible of war, and in a quiet suburb in Ohio, retired Captain Daniel Hayes pulled a dusty tactical bag from his attic, his wife watching silently as he prepared to leave. In a Montana ranch house, former Lieutenant Jacob Morrow canceled a family barbecue, his grandchildren puzzled but his resolve unshaken. In a Florida retirement home, Dr. Nathan Ellis, once the team's medic, packed a medical kit with the same precision he'd used in the field, and from different corners of the country, they converged on Willow Creek, drawn by a loyalty that time could not erode. Back in the park, Elias sat on the bench, the cut on his forehead crusting over, the pain in his hip a distant hum, his eyes half closed in a state of rest that was never truly sleep, a habit from years of staying alert in hostile territory. And as the afternoon stretched into evening, the bikers rolled into the park, their engines roaring with a deliberate menace. Their stunts near the old playground scattering a few lingering families. But they hadn't yet noticed Elias, who sat unmoving, a statue carved from memory and resilience, waiting with the patience of a man who had once lain in ambush for hours under enemy fire. At exactly 10:48 p.m. on May 14, 2025, the first black SUV entered the park, its government plates gleaming under the streetlights, followed by a second, then a third, then a fourth, each vehicle moving with a precision that spoke of decades of training, their American flag emblems subtle but unmistakable, and they formed a perimeter around the park's central square. A containment pattern Elias recognized instantly, one he'd helped devise during covert operations in Southeast Asia, and as the doors opened in unison, the men who stepped out were not the young soldiers of Kisan, but their echoes, gray-haired and weathered, yet carrying themselves with an unshakable purpose, each wearing a simple black shirt with the 72nd Division insignia, a symbol of a brotherhood that had never faded. Colonel Everett reached Elias first, his knees creaking as he knelt beside the bench, a gesture of respect that silenced the park. "Sergeant Thornton," echoed team reporting as ordered, he said, his voice steady, and Elias, for the first time that day, felt the weight of his solitude lift. "You didn't all have to come," he murmured, and Jacob Morrow, standing beside Everett, replied, "All or none, that's how it's always been." And Dr. Ellis, his hands still steady despite his age, began examining Elias's injuries, his touch gentle but firm. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his tone quiet but laced with a steel that made the air grow heavy, and Elias nodded toward the bikers, who now stood frozen, their bravado evaporating as they realized the gravity of what was unfolding. Everett rose, turning to face the bikers, his posture calm but his eyes cold. "These men assaulted Medal of Honor recipient Sergeant Elias Thornton," he announced, his voice carrying across the park, and a murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of the SUVs, and as smartphones appeared, capturing the moment, the lanky biker, his confidence shattered, stammered, "He's just an old guy, we didn't know." But Daniel Hayes stepped forward, removing his own Medal of Honor from around his neck, holding it up for all to see. "In 1968, Elias Thornton led a mission in Kisan that saved 16 American POWs. He held off an enemy platoon single-handedly, wounded 4 times, to ensure his team made it to extraction. I was one of those men," he said, and the crowd's murmur grew into a wave of awe, several people removing their hats, others whispering words of respect, and the bikers, now fully aware of the man they'd wronged, shrank back, their leader's face pale, his hands trembling as he muttered, "We didn't mean any harm." But Everett's gaze didn't soften. "You meant to humiliate a man who risked everything for this country, a man who deserved better than your cruelty." And as the tension hung in the air, a young woman named Clara, a local barista who had been walking her dog, approached Elias, her eyes brimming with tears. "My dad was in the Gulf War. He always said the real heroes don't talk about it. I'm so sorry this happened." "To you," she said, and Elias, his voice soft, replied, "Tell your dad he's right, and thank you." And Clara's small act of kindness was the spark that ignited a change in Willow Creek, as more townspeople stepped forward, offering words of support, their shame at their earlier indifference fueling a newfound resolve. By the next morning, news of the incident had spread, first through social media posts on X, where Clara's video of the confrontation garnered 1 million views in hours, then through local news outlets, which ran headlines like, "Forgotten Hero Honored After Gas Station Assault," and the town's mayor, a pragmatic woman named Ellen Harper, organized an impromptu ceremony at the Willow Creek Community Center, a modest brick building that hadn't seen such a crowd in years, its folding chairs filled with residents, veterans, and even a few reporters from nearby cities, all eager to hear the story of Elias Thornton, the man who had lived among them for decades, unseen, uncelebrated, until now. And as Elias sat in the front row, uncomfortable with the attention, his team surrounded him, their presence a shield against the weight of the spotlight, and Mayor Harper spoke with a sincerity that cut through the room. "For 50 years, Elias Thornton has walked our streets, mowed his own lawn, shared stories with our children at the library, and we never knew the hero in our midst. Today, we right that wrong." And when it was Elias's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his cap still on, his voice steady but quiet. "I didn't call my team for recognition, I called them because I needed to remember a time when we stood for each other, when no one was left behind. I don't ask for your praise, I ask that you look at the people around you, the ones who struggle quietly, the ones who served silently, and see them, because their stories matter." And the room fell silent, his words a mirror held up to a town that had forgotten how to look. A young girl, no more than 10, broke away from her mother, a single daisy clutched in her hand, and approached Elias, her voice small but clear. "My grandpa says you're a hero, he was in the army too." And she handed him the flower, which Elias accepted with a nod. "Your grandpa's a hero too, little one," he said, and the gesture inspired others, as families, veterans, and even the bikers, who had arrived at the ceremony with a newfound humility, came forward, the lanky biker stepping up last, his voice trembling. "We were wrong, sir. Our club wants to make it right. We'll volunteer to maintain the park, help veterans in town, whatever you need." And Elias, seeing the sincerity in the young man's eyes, nodded. "Make it right by being better, that's all I ask." And in that moment, redemption took root, not just for the bikers, but for Willow Creek itself, which pledged to build a small monument in the park, its inscription reading, "Valor endures, honor those who serve." A tribute not just to Elias, but to all the veterans who had returned to quiet lives, their sacrifices unseen until a moment of crisis revealed their truth. As the ceremony ended, a local mechanic named Tom, who had seen the news, approached Elias with an offer to restore the Chevy C10 at no cost. "It's the least I can do," he said, and Elias, for the first time in years, felt the warmth of community, a warmth he'd thought lost to time, and as he prepared to leave, he affixed a small sticker to his truck's bumper. "Vietnam Veteran." A quiet declaration of a truth he no longer felt the need to hide, and Colonel Everett, standing beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You good, Elias?" he asked, and Elias, looking out at the town that had finally seen him, replied, "I am now. Sometimes it takes a fall to stand taller." And Everett smiled. "You never fell, we just forgot to salute." And as the Echo team gathered for a final embrace, their bond as strong as it had been in the jungles of Kisan, Elias drove home under a sky streaked with the colors of dusk, no longer a shadow, but a beacon, a reminder that valor doesn't fade, it waits to be recognized, and in every quiet hero, there lies a story worth telling, a legacy worth honoring, a life worth seeing.